All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Central Florida Foundation's community conversation on how nonprofits and government work together. Today, we're really excited to bring you subject matter experts that are going to represent different pieces of this conversation. And we're really excited to get started with this webinar. Now, before we kick things off, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. My name's Lori. I work for for Central Florida Foundation. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications. So I would be remiss to not talk about our podcast, First You Talk. If you go online to our podcast, and I have Neil and our team going to drop some links into the chat. We have a lot of podcast episodes for you to take a look at and listen to, and we're currently working on a few bigger episodes that we're excited to release later this month, maybe early March. So make sure you check out First You Talk. You can find us on any podcast platform, and we're really excited to bring you some more content in the next month or so. Okay, just a few items that I wanted to talk about and how to communicate with us during this webinar. If you have questions, awesome. We want you to ask them. Use the Q&A feature. Now, some panelists might be able to respond to you via typing during the webinar, but if not, we're going to try our best to get your question into the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. In the last about 20 minutes, we'll do a more open discussion session. Panelists, like I said, might reply, but if you submitted a question at registration, which we did receive questions, I have those listed here, and I'll try my best to work those into the Q&A at the end. For this webinar, we hope that you leave with a few different pieces of understanding, an understanding of the three sectors of our economy and how they interact, an understanding of how public independent partnerships are structured. And again, public and independent are words that we use, but we're talking about public being government and independent being nonprofit, strategies for supporting these types of partnerships, and then finally, some real world examples of these partnerships in our community. Without further ado, we do have three amazing panelists that I will introduce as we go through each presentation. And the first one is going to be our very own Mark Brewer. So Mark is going to join us, and Mark actually just celebrated 25 years with the foundation. He joined the foundation in 2000 and has earned respect for building community partnerships that meet issues head on and produce measurable results. He has worked with hundreds of individuals, families, and corporations to establish philanthropic plans, endowments, funding strategies, plan gifts. More than 150 regional nonprofit boards have enlisted Mark's assistance through the foundation with strategic and scenario planning initiatives that included the use of endowed investments to sustain their organizations. Mark is everywhere. He is a public speaker. He is a strategic extraordinaire. I could keep going, Mark, but I'm going to stop so you have time to speak today.
Thanks, Lori, and good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to have you here for this discussion. So I thought I would start you back in high school at Civics 101, and I'm doing this because the discussion we're going to have today has some complicated sides to it, and it's kind of nice to start with the big map so that you can put a pin in each piece of the map to understand how they all fit together. So I'm going to start you with this big pie from high school civics class. All democratic capitalist societies essentially have three economic sectors. One is the public sector, that's government. One is the private sector, that's all the businesses. And then one is the independent sector, sometimes called the third sector, but it's made up of nonprofits and faith organizations. Now, nonprofits love to call themselves nonprofits, but economists normally refer to the nonprofit sector as the independent sector because its job is to be innovative and creative in solving complex social problems, healthcare, education, arts and culture, human services, the environment, and of course, the entire faith-based community is also nonprofit or independent. And so when this sector creates innovative and creative solutions to things, then it attracts capital from the other two sectors, the public sector and the private sector. The public sector is government, and whichever side of government you align with doesn't really matter. The reality is that government has a role in all kinds of support structures for people who live within the jurisdictions of government. And I say that because sometimes people forget, they think of the government as being a place that works on things that we hear about in politics. In reality, even the Constitution has a preamble that indicates that a government is responsible for the safety and security of its citizens. So that's not just protecting the borders, it's also making sure people have access to food and jobs and other things that they need to be successful. Now, the public sector gets all of its dollars from taxpayers, and so taxpayers are the ones that fund the things that the government does. But the government has some responsibilities that it may or may not have total funding for. So that's where it gets a little tricky thinking about the government. There are things that it may have responsibility for that it doesn't have a whole infrastructure or system to do. And that's kind of where the private sector comes in to kind of finish this pie. The private sector's job is to create wealth. And so in a democratic society, we typically think of the private sector as being the place that is supposed to generate and create wealth for both its owners and its employees. And their job then is to pay the public sector some form of tax to get the services that are necessary and that the public sector is responsible for. And then we want them to donate money or invest money into the independent sector in order to go out and do things that might be more complicated or take more time. Before we move to the next slide, I do just want to remind you that all three of these sectors interact with each other constantly. And we can tell you at the Central Florida Foundation, nothing important ever gets done unless all three sectors are involved together in trying to solve it. So the money may come from only one sector or it may come from all the sectors, but at the end of the day, it's important to have the concepts, the strategies put together by all three sectors. So that moves us into thinking a little bit about how did we get to the place that we are? So if independent sector folks are sometimes working with funding from the public sector, it's because the public sector has a responsibility, but the independent sector has the resources, the expertise, or the right amount of collaboration in order to get things done that the government can't do by itself. And so we got to where we are today because that collaboration is critically important. Whether you're talking about major issues like homelessness and housing, or you're talking about daily issues like safety and security of kids getting to school, there's probably an independent sector business, a nonprofit, involved in all the things that the government does at one step or another. Also, the independent sector can't do the work that it does without government as a partner, not only because policy plays a role in some of the things that nonprofits do, but also because the funding that the government provides gives the nonprofits the resources they need to do it. Now, if you're an average nonprofit in Central Florida, it's possible that if you're in the human services space, or even in the other spaces, healthcare, education, even arts and culture, as much as 70% of your funding could come from a government or multiple governments. So what I want you to take from this is that if all three sectors work together on tough problems at the idea level and at the strategy level, then the public and independent sectors can work especially close as these two cohorts go directly into the systems that need to be changed in order to solve it. Now, the private sector needs to be at the table too, because while it creates wealth, not all of its wealth come to the other two sectors. And if we don't hear from the private sector in trying to figure out how to solve problems, then the takeaways won't work as well. It's never a good idea to do things to people. It's always better to do it with them. So when you're trying to solve problems for somebody in another sector or somebody in a community that you don't have a direct relationship with, it likely isn't going to work out. Getting all three sectors together sometimes solves that problem.
Thanks, Mark. I wanted to ask a question. when we're talking about the nonprofit sector, we at the foundation often choose to use the word independent. Would you mind sharing why that choice of word?
Yeah, so I mentioned in the beginning there that the independent sector's role is to be innovative and creative to help uh, make things work in a community. And when it does that, it attracts capital. The other two sectors can't actually do anything until they have capital. Now, that may sound strange to you, especially if you happen to be in the independent sector. You're probably thinking, oh, I can't do anything without money. But in the private sector, we have to raise money from investors in order to put a product or service together. And then we have to have customers in order to buy it. If we don't have one or the other, then however great what we've put together isn't going to happen. And the government, even with its responsibilities, can't get those responsibilities done if nobody pays taxes. So the independent sector's primary role is to bring innovation and creativity to things that the other two sectors either can't do or won't do. And when I say they won't do it, I don't mean that because they're being nasty. They won't do it because it's not part of their resource or capability. And thus, if you can get all three sectors together, with the independent sector being a part of that puzzle, you'll get more things done. And that's why economists typically refer to the sector as the independent sector. It's independent of having to have a flow of resources to do something until it figures out the best way to do it, and then that attracts capital.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right, Mark, we'll see you in a little while when we get to the Q&A session. Thank you.
All right.
All right, we are going to now chat with Sandi Vidal. She is our Vice President of Community Strategies and Initiatives for Central Florida Foundation. I love the first line of her bio. She is just a girl trying to change the world one day at a time, and I can attest to that. I work with her side by side most days, and she really is trying to make the world a better place every single day. Within her role at the foundation, Sandi works on a variety of initiatives, including the Sustainable Development Goals, poverty alleviation, and social justice, and is a staff liaison for the 100 Women Strong Giving Circle we have at the foundation. Sandi is a graduate of the University of Miami School of Business with a degree in business administration, and she's a diehard Kane fan, or I'm sorry, a diehard Kane in a house full of Knowles. She has over 15 years of nonprofit leadership and over 20 years of business management experience. Hello, Sandi. How are you?
Good. That makes me sound old when I say I have that much experience, right?
Wise, wise.
I'll take that. Thank you, Lori. We can go to the next slide. So this slide has a lot going on, but one of the things, if you have ever been around me, you probably have heard me say that as a society, we outsource some of our most complex issues to nonprofits, which is true. And the reason for that is they are the boots on the ground, and they're really, in many cases, the subject matter experts when it comes to what's happening in the community and what is really needed. So Mark referenced earlier that we don't want to do things to people, we want to do things with people. And nonprofits really have the opportunity to hear from people who are experiencing the work that's being done in the community. Not every nonprofit in our community is focused on problem solving. Some are focused on just basic needs. They may be a pantry where people are just going to get food. They're not thinking about the bigger issue as to why we need the food in the first place. But that's okay, because we need both. We need to be able to provide those services. When it comes to government, there's different structures within the local governments and different mandates that they follow. For example, the city of Orlando is not required to do human services. Now, they have a very robust grant program, and they do make grants to organizations that do human services, but they themselves don't run human service programs, where the county has a different charter and a different responsibility when it comes to human services. So not only do they grant, but they do have their own departments that are providing some services, and I'll let Lavon talk more about that. So a couple of things to note. On the slide, you'll see the question about public and independent sector partnerships. And that's really, oftentimes referred to as a public-private partnership, which can include business as well. But nonprofits can partner with local governments to deliver public services more efficiently. Again, a lot of times they don't have that added bureaucracy and they're able to deliver services directly. The other thing is the government can't be all things to all people at all times. And so this gives them an opportunity to be able to reach out to organizations that are doing the work in the community who have the means to get these jobs done. So an example of that might be a nonprofit providing affordable housing can work with the city's housing department or the county's housing department to access funding or resources, but they're also bringing other forms of funding to the table as well. Usually they're not relying on just one source of funding. The other thing is nonprofits really need to consider several factors when it comes to ensuring successful partnerships with working with a local government. And some of those important things to consider, you see on the left-hand side, government establishes goals and then looks to the outside to be able to achieve those goals. And so some of those opportunities might be grant funding. It might be a local government providing grants or funding opportunities to nonprofits to implement a community program. I mentioned food pantries earlier, so it may be the city or the county is providing money to buy that food to be able to deliver to the citizens of the community so that they're meeting the community's basic needs. You also might see service contracts. So oftentimes grants to nonprofits or contracts are done on reimbursement. So it's really more about making sure that you're hitting the outputs as well as the outcomes. You have a certain number of people you have to serve or certain number of classes that you need to hold or whatever you're being contracted for. One of the examples of that might also be that the city or county is outsourcing running a shelter, a homeless shelter, or something to that effect. So you'll see oftentimes that city or county governments, even the federal government, will outsource to nonprofits, and those can come either in the form of grants or service contracts. The other thing is, as organizations get involved with taking money from city or county governments, it's really important for them to consider some factors. And the first is making sure that their mission aligns with the priorities of the local government. Oftentimes, nonprofits will go where the money is, and the important thing to make sure is that it aligns with the mission of the nonprofit as well as the government. You also want to make sure that the relationship is mutually beneficial. Here's my words today. But you want to make sure that it's a win-win for both sides, that the nonprofit is able to deliver the services, that the government is able to really focus on what should that program be and how they can work together on it. The other thing to remember is there's going to be bureaucracy. You're never going to work with a government and have it just figure it out as you go along, report whatever you want. It's going to have some layers to it. It's going to have regulations that they have to follow. There's timelines, there's procedures. I know I've talked to Lavon several times and she's like, we have a process. And that's true. And so when it comes to government funding, you'll have to follow that process. The other thing, and we can note this from the recent funding freeze, is that government funding can be unpredictable. There's times when priorities change. There are times when you might receive notice of something like a federal freeze, and that can drive a lot of people into panic. So it's important for most nonprofits to try to make sure that they have more than one source of income. And I think, as Mark mentioned, when it's 70%, it's really a great deal of a nonprofit's budget. And so that can be really harmful to the nonprofit. Fortunately, in this case, the funding freeze was lifted, but I think it's something that we still need to watch and be aware of. The other thing is that there is regulation, as I mentioned before, that can also lead to additional costs when it comes to financial audits and things like that. There's got to be a level of transparency. Your performance is going to be tracked, which I think is important for any funder, but the government in particular has an obligation to the taxpayers. And so there's going to be some additional reporting that may happen there. The other thing is collecting and sharing the data on program outcomes, your spending, and any impact that you have. The government's going to want to report out on what they're doing in the community, and part of that is concerned with what the nonprofits are doing. And then I think the other things that are really important from a perspective of government and nonprofit working together is that things can be political. Political structures change. We have a mayor that in a bit is going to be coming up for a reelection. We have one that has been in place for many, many years who has said he's not going to run again. And so that may change some of the goals and priorities of the local governments. So there's political dynamics that may be involved there. There's also a high standard for ethics and making sure that you're reaching not only the community-driven goals, but there's honesty and transparency. And I think that's the case with nonprofits anyway, and hopefully everybody is meeting those standards. The other thing is building those relationships, and having strong relationships with your government leaders is really important. And I think in this day and age, it can be beneficial to be able to feel comfortable picking up the phone and having a conversation with your government leaders. And then, regular communication, participation in meetings that are community or public meetings can be beneficial as well. You can go to the next slide, Lauren. And so, not all nonprofit relationships or partnerships with the government have to involve dollars. Oftentimes we think about it from the perspective of dollars, but it's not always the case. So here we have on the slide partnerships with community foundations. You heard in Mark's bio, he often gets called on to convene groups, to provide advice, to do consulting work. And so that's something that you might see a community foundation or other nonprofit doing. There's also times where nonprofits are called in as subject matter experts, and we oftentimes call our nonprofits in as subject matter experts, but it may be serving on a task force. I know I serve on the mental health task force for Orange County government. I've served on the advisory for multicultural affairs for the city of Orlando. And so oftentimes the government will reach out to the nonprofit sector or independent sector for that. The other things when it comes to opportunities for nonprofits and the government to collaborate can really be around addressing community needs effectively. And again, it doesn't always mean money. It can mean things like advocacy and policy development. I know I've been part of the League of Women Voters for many years, and we've always had a representative who's part of the charter review for the county. There's also public awareness campaigns. When we were looking at vaccinations for COVID, trying to get the word out about vaccinations or get vaccinations to individuals, particularly in under-resourced communities, may be partnering with nonprofits to do that. I know the census is going to be coming up in 5 years, and the government oftentimes will partner with nonprofits to make sure that we're reaching everybody in the community for the census. The other thing is sharing space. So I remember when the Pulse tragedy happened, the United Way was able to work with Orange County government to provide services using an Orange County building for the United Way Assistance Center. And so sometimes those type of resources will happen. Emergency and disaster relief, emergency response. The emergency response centers oftentimes will have nonprofit leaders who are part of their emergency response team or sitting in the emergency response center. And then the other thing I think that's important is data sharing and resources. Again, the nonprofits in the community are collecting data that they can share with local governments, as well as vice versa, where the governments are collecting data on the larger masses of people and resources, and they can share that information as well. So the takeaway, I think, for this is there's really a lot of ways that government and the independent sectors can intersect and work together. And oftentimes it doesn't involve dollars. It can involve, just your intellectual presence, your subject matter expertise. If you're a nonprofit, if you're just curious about this and not part of the nonprofit sector, this gives you some examples of how those two intersect.
Thanks, Sandy. I appreciate your expertise. And we are going to move on to our final panelist. We have Lavon Williams joining us. Hello, good morning, Lavon.
Good morning.
Okay, so Lavon, a true Floridian, was born and raised on a farm just outside of Gainesville, Florida. She is currently married to Ernest Williams and has two sons, Justin and Jason. She serves as a deputy director for the Community and Family Services Department of Orange County Government, a social services agency. She brings a background in public administration, urban planning, economic development, social services, event planning, neighborhood outreach, and community building. In her 27 years with Orange County, she has worked closely with nonprofit organizations, community leaders, and volunteers, teaching leadership skills and strategies. Her undergraduate studies were completed at the University of North Florida. She continued her education at Florida State University, where she obtained a master's in public administration and a master's in urban planning. Lavon is also a graduate of Florida A&M University College of Law and is an attorney. Welcome, Lavon.
Well, thank you. I am so excited to be here today. So excited to talk about my favorite subject, working with government, nonprofits working together with government. Um, Let me begin just by stating the elephant in the room. Government is always changing, as we know from just this past few days, this past week or so. Things are always changing. And the days of we're here from government and we're here to help are long gone. Government cannot independently meet all the needs of our citizens, which are growing much more diverse and in some cases have greater depth than they ever have in the past. Therefore, it's important for public sector, what we think of as government, the public sector to be clear on its priorities and capabilities so that partners can most appropriately come alongside and leverage effectively. So let's be clear and upfront about partnering with government. It does require more than just a passion for what you want to do. Um, you have to know more than just the people that you are looking to serve. As Sandy said, as a partner, you're brought into a web of policies and processes and procedures. And if you're not prepared, it can be very overwhelming. And most importantly, it can be very costly. There are some implications for you. So you can move to the next slide. What I want to do is really give a deeper dive into what does it mean to work with local governments, particularly. While I have experience in state and a little bit of federal, I just want to focus on local governments because that's where the bulk of my experience is. And I think that's really where the rubber hits the road. I think that's where we're really seeing the impacts. So from my perspective, nonprofits have a unique, as Sandy said, boots on the ground perspective and experience that allows you to position yourselves as subject matter experts. I work with Community and Family Services, which is a human services agency. And we like to say we're the place where joy lives, hope grows, and help happens. It's a place where we hope that people can find respite and find services and find things that will allow them to live most successfully. So I just want to say that's the direction that I'm speaking from. So as nonprofits, you have to have a clear and concise mission. That is something that Sandy just mentioned. It is so important that your mission is clear and that you know precisely how that mission relates to the goals and objectives of the local government entity or of any government entity that you're trying to align with. So when you are working together with local governments or working together with any government, it's important that you have at least four things in place. One, that you know who your beneficiaries are. Be clear and I would say be precise about who your beneficiaries are and how we're going to serve them. And how will those services be delivered? That's number two. How will those services be delivered and by whom? Who's going to deliver those services? And we know as local governments and as governments, we look to the nonprofits and say, you're our nonprofit provider. But specifically, who's providing the services to those who will be benefiting? And then thirdly, what are the costs of service delivery? Sometimes, and we'll talk about this a little more in the next slide, sometimes that is the trickiest part, understanding how those service deliveries are actually going to be calculated in terms of monetary costs. And then fourth, how we will measure or how will we prove that we are successful? That is so important. Those four components, who we're benefiting, how we're going to benefit them, how is it going to cost? What is it going to cost? And how are we going to know we are successful? Those things are so important for you to have to think through before jumping into a partnership. Or as Sandy mentioned, you don't want to chase the dollars. You want to be intentional and deliberate about what you're hoping to accomplish. So many nonprofits, of course, are born out of great ideas. They're meeting needs, they're serving gaps, they're looking at places in the community where people are underserved. But it's not enough just to stop there. To position your organization to partner with government, you'll need to see the trees and the forest. So let me explain what I mean by that. You may know as a nonprofit agency the name and the details and the stories behind everyone that comes in contact with your agency. And that's particularly important. And that's what makes you as a nonprofit so uniquely positioned. But if you're going to work with government, you also at the same time need to communicate the commonalities of the people that you serve, the linkages and the costs associated with those body of clients. Knowing you're benefiting clients individually and collectively helps you make reasonable argument for the cost burden to the public for the benefit of those in need. And that, let me be clear on that. That's at the end of the day, the most important thing. How can you show that what you're asking in terms of partnership and what you're hoping to serve is beneficial to the overall public community? Serving as subject matter experts means that you understand your why and how it translates to the larger community. That's the most important thing. So the next slide, let's go a little deeper. Let's talk about some real world examples. It's a real delicate balance because I didn't want to talk about this XYZ agency, but what I did do and was able to kind of go through our process and kind of look at lessons learned and looked at successes that we've had. And we're particularly proud of the work that we've been able to do around children and unique children services and families and also around crime prevention and safety. Those are some things that we feel like worked really, really, really well. So let's talk about what those really, really well looks like. Really, really well, or those good partnerships that worked well, are those where the nonprofit that we worked with had the capacity. And by capacity, I mean they had the staff or committed volunteers, they had policies and procedures in place, and they also were able to explain in great detail how the work actually happens. They also had experience. They had both professional and lived experience and or I should say lived experience in the area. So for instance, when we're looking at serving people who are justice involved, for instance, and helping them get back into the community and then obtain job or to obtain job training and then obtain a job, it is so critical that we work with nonprofits who really understand the experiential um, situations of the individuals that we're serving, both either as an agency or as through lived experience. And then financially, I can't talk about this enough. It really, really does matter, your financials. Having just as simple as making sure you have a bank account. You have to have a bank account for your nonprofit that is exclusive. And having audited financials is something that works really, really well for us when we were able to work with agencies that could show that they had the robust ability to be able to manage public funds. It is a stewardship relationship where we're entrusting you, the public is entrusting you with public funds. And so we have to make sure that you are able to manage those funds and to meet the needs of those who we're setting to serve. And sometimes there are situations where things don't go well. So let's talk about that a little bit. What happens when things don't go well? Let's talk about some obstacles that can get in the way of partnerships. I talked about capacity in terms of successes, but sometimes when we talk about capacity and things that don't go well, it is in that area of lacking capacity. So what happens? A nonprofit underestimates the amount of staff time, for instance, that it will take to do the work, or underestimates the workload, or underestimates the cost of doing business. That is something that often gets in the way or can cause a partnership to go awry. Or another thing that Sandi talked about is understanding the government that you're working and contracting with. I know I've experienced this in the past where I'm in the middle of drafting a contract or negotiating a project, and the nonprofit entity says, well, this government does this. Well, I don't understand why you can't do this. Well, we will hope that before you start to partner with us, that you've done a little research so you know how this entity that you're working with really does work. Because governments are different. What one government can do, what a city government can do, is different than what a county government can do, different than what a state government can do. And all of that can vary by state, by locality, et cetera. So it's very important to know the government that you're contracting with, and particularly the funding source that they're using to contract with you. Some situations that have gone wrong with us before is if we're contracting, we've had situations where we contract with, for instance, what we call our general funds, which are general tax dollars, property tax dollars, more specifically. And we'll contract with nonprofit A with that particular funding source. Well, later on, we may come back and say, we would like to contract with you through one of our federal grants. But the nuances of those funding sources are very different. And then they require different responsibilities of our nonprofits. So it's important for you to understand not just the entity that you're working with, but the funding source that you're being funded through, because that is sometimes where things can go wrong. Understanding procedures is another thing. Understanding the procedures that are required, the application process, the review, the contracting, the monitoring, the reporting, all of that is critical to making sure that your partnership is a success. I want to talk a little bit about grant agreements. Grant agreements are legal contracts, and the proposals that you send in are public documents. Never take that lightly, particularly if you're working with federal and state grant funds. Don't take lightly that I can sit overnight and just put together a proposal, send it in, and hope I get funded, and that there won't be repercussions to that. That is very risky. That is very risky. You want to make sure that you really take the time to develop a proposal that you can defend all the way through from page one to the very last page. I've had situations where individual nonprofits maybe took more time at the beginning of the document, but not at the end of the document or the application or proposal. And so, unfortunately, they may have committed themselves to something that they didn't put a lot of time into either researching or editing, because editing is a bit important too. Making sure that what you say at the beginning is the same thing that you say at the end of your proposal and at the end of your application. So I just wanted to point that out. And then failure to deliver your services is one more thing that we just want to close out and talk about. At the end of the day, you have to deliver the services that you say that you're going to deliver. So what's the real takeaway here? Communities cultivate cooperation and cohesiveness by leveraging the strengths of government and nonprofit partnerships to find common ground to create positive social change. That is ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to work together to create change in our communities. Our deliverables, our measurable outcomes, all of that matters. And so when you're partnering with local government, we just hope that you will, one, consider it, and then two, that you'll be mindful of all of these little nuances that we've discussed today. So thank you. Thank you so very much. And I'll turn it back over to Lori.
Thank you, Lavon. That was great. I appreciate it. I love hearing your perspective. I appreciate you being here. Okay, we are going to move on to the Q&A period. But before we do that, I did want to share that if you want to stay in touch with us and hear about our next webinar that comes up, you can go ahead and sign up for our newsletter. Neil's going to drop that in the chat box so you can sign up and keep informed on when we'll be having our next webinar, which will be exciting. Okay, so we are going to now talk about some questions. Again, feel free to hop in, panelists, however you see fit. This should be an open conversation. So let's see here. First and foremost, the name of this kind of series that we're hosting is How Can You Be a Confident Giver? So as somebody who is a philanthropist, a giver, someone who wants to donate or even support in a way that doesn't involve dollars, what are some ways that the individual or an organization could support these public independent sector partnerships?
I think Lavon said it best. Make certain that you understand the outcomes being produced by this partnership and invest in the outcomes. I hear a lot of individual donors, they get concerned if something's funded by the government and they think, I just had a conversation with somebody not long ago who was saying to me, well, they get a lot of government funding. And I said, nobody gets government funding. They get a contract with the government to do something for which they usually get paid less than what it costs them to actually do it, right? And so the concept that because something is funded by a public sector agency, that should attract individual donors and other institutions, because now we're partnering in the cost of things, which makes it more efficient. And just remember, you're investing giving to the outcomes being produced, not to the stuff that's being done.
Yeah, I would agree with that absolutely, because it takes more than just boots on the ground and a little bit of funding from government. It takes all of us working together to make things work. I'm looking for an example at our Financial Empowerment Center that we've just recently launched with Orange County, and that takes all of us working together, and the outcome being helping our community to become more financially stable and therefore supporting and undergirding our economy. That is so important. So when you're giving to that, you're giving to the Financial Empowerment Center, you're giving to the economy to stabilizing our economy.
Thank you. Another question that we received was, is there any sort of way for the individual to know what nonprofits are working with government or vice versa?
I can say that from Orange County's perspective, it's all on our website. And I'll give you those links. I can't do it right now because I'm not technically savvy, but I will give you those links where you can go and you can see all of the contracted agencies. It's on the website. And if nothing else, you can call. And if you're curious about any particular agency, you can call and ask. It's all public record, so it's all available. So don't feel like it's a big secret or anything. The other thing is, there are two places on our website I want to clarify. There's our procurement website, which tells you agencies that have received funding through a competitive bidding or application process and contracting process. But then there are also service providers that we contract with that may just have license agreements. Sandi talked about having space in county buildings. They're not receiving direct funding, but they are using space in local government or county facilities. So you can also get a list of those as well.
So that's a great resource. That'll tell you who's working with Orange County. If you just want to get a sense for nonprofits working with government, you can also use nonprofit search, where you'll be able to identify nonprofits that have revenue streams from government.
That's a great point, Neil. If you wouldn't mind dropping the nonprofit search link into the chat box, that's a great point as well. Okay, another question is, so we talked about these two sectors in quite in a lot of detail. How can or does the private sector fit into these partnerships? Do they ever fit into these partnerships? Can we talk about that a bit?
I guess I can go from our perspective. A lot of times we're looking at the private sector, as you say, to bring in, I think Mark, you mentioned to bring infrastructure that and bring resources and capacity that government just doesn't have. And that is how it undergirds the work and the partnerships that we're doing to ultimately serve the people.
Yeah, and in specific human services places, you can't do the work without the private sector. It doesn't make much sense to do workforce job training if there aren't any places for people to go get jobs after you do that. So the private sector being a part of that is really important. Also, some of the biggest things we've ever done in this community, several years ago when we rewired the homeless services network and the whole structure, that was a public-private partnership where the public and private sectors were at the table with the independent sector in order to work through that. In fact, leaders from the county, the city, the nonprofit sector, and private sector all traveled to Houston to look at how they dealt with homelessness and their successes and failures. And then we all traveled to Salt Lake City to look at how they dealt with the problems with a different form of homelessness. And that helped instruct and get us kind of focused on how to do it here. The reason that's really important is because we wanted private sector investment, donors, but we also wanted the private sector to support the policy that had to change in order to get it done. So it doesn't really matter if you have a brilliant idea about policy and you and the government decide that this will probably work better, but then none of the voters or people in the private sector know what it is, think it's important, or understand how it works.
Absolutely. Okay. Here is a maybe more timely one. I know that Sandi mentioned it briefly, but we had a question. What are some suggested strategies to help foster existing relationships when government leadership, either elected or appointed, when they change?
The one thing that I would say on that is when I was a nonprofit executive director, the thing that I tried to do was make sure that I was in communication with all of my funders on a regular basis. And so just making sure that you're aware of when those things change, know when elections happen, or if something happens that is beyond an election cycle, and then reach out and introduce yourself if you haven't already met them. I know when people were running for mayor, I met with them before they became mayor so that they were aware of who I was, and we could start to build that relationship. Even if they didn't win their election, we still had some connections. So I think it's important to build those relationships and make sure that they know who you are. Lavon may have more advice.
Yeah, I would say in addition to connecting with the executive, I would make connections and build relationships within the administrative part of government. People, civil servants like me, for instance, knowing who the heads of the departments are and making connections with them, because that's particularly important. One, because that gives us that exercise of being able to be that think tank together. And then two, it gives you inroads into what's coming down the line. So I would say definitely in addition to building relationships with the executives, but definitely try to work with the administrative staff as well.
Yeah, so for nonprofits that are engaged in policy work, they know this. It's good to know your elected official, but you better know the chief of staff and you better understand who's actually doing the grunt work inside the campaign, because if you don't know those people, then you're not going to be able to get much done. People used to always say everyone needs to know who their elected officials are. And I always say all elected officials need to know who you are. And you need to know all the people that staff the work that they've committed in the running for the office to do. And that's where the partnerships come.
Thank you. Here's another question. Can you lose government funding if private sector funding doesn't align with government values, though provides funding for the nonprofit? That was someone who is in attendance right now, so I'm not sure if we need clarity around that.
So I'll try to answer as much as I can understand. Can you lose government funding? Um, Ultimately, the answer to that is yes. You can lose government funding in the sense that if you are dependent upon an annual allotment and you're using that to build your capacity, and you, for some reason, either, and I talked about this before, not meeting your deliverables, not meeting the outcomes, not having successful monitorings, not producing those audited financials, all of those things can get in the way, and then you're not renewed, that could be a loss in funding. So yes, you could lose government funding. The other challenge, and this kind of goes back to when we were talking about things that go wrong, is that sometimes midway through the process, we realize, or through early on in the process, as we're putting things together, it looks like it's not going to come in together in terms of a full contract. That could be a challenge for you as well. So there are many stages to it, but if I'm answering the question, which I think it is, can you lose government funding in the process? Yes, you can. You can lose it if you don't deliver and if you're not renewed.
Yeah, I'm not sure, when it comes to other funders and government funding, what the question about relationship is. I know that there's specific things that government funding can't do that private funding could do. And so there may be a blend of it, but if that is the case, there just has to be a clear separation of what that is. For example, in a faith-based organization, you may be, sharing your faith with somebody, but the government fund can't do that. They might be able to provide food to you or other services, but that particular piece of what you do would be outside of that realm. So a private funder could certainly fund that piece of it, and they could be compatible, but you couldn't require that as part of being able to receive those government services. And so, there may be a difference of opinion on what it is you're doing, but I don't think one affects the other unless you blend them in a way that would be a violation of the contract.
Okay, we probably have time for one or two more questions. What tools do you currently use or maybe suggest to support cross collaboration? This question specifies between nonprofits and government initiatives, but I think across any cross collaboration effort, are there tools that you can employ or use during this process to support these partnerships?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by tools. I'm not sure. Are you saying software or
Yeah.
I don't know what you mean by that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I don't think it necessarily means software, but how are people maybe talking to each other and how are they connecting and what places are they convening, perhaps, is how I'm interpreting it.
So I know we have through our office a number of forums where we will invite nonprofits. In fact, there was one maybe 2 weeks ago, a forum where we brought nonprofits in to talk about how to work with our human services agencies. That's a way to connect. A lot of lunch and learns and a lot of lunch meetings. That's what I'm trying to say. Lunch meetings where we invite uh, communities, or we don't invite, usually communities invite us to come and talk. And then just your basic, just getting on the calendar and sharing your story is so important to building those relationships as well. Don't hesitate to do that. Don't hesitate to reach out to the head of the department or the head of a particular division and say, I'd like to come and tell you more about my agency. Can I get on your calendar? Those are I would, so if there was a tool, I would say use your calendar tool and get on everyone's calendar and make sure you're out there telling your story and attending forums and attending networking opportunities.
And then really, I want to jam this one in here really quickly because I think it's a curiosity for a lot of people. Is there always a long delay in public payment for nonprofit services and products? I don't know if this is talking about kind of the reimbursement structure that there typically is, if you guys can speak to that.
Would you like me? I can speak to it because I know I deal with it with the contracts that I manage. It is, I feel so sad sometimes when agencies don't realize that governments rarely can just cut a check. It's rare. Um, what usually has to happen, most of the time, we're working on a reimbursement basis. So you have to have the capital to run your program and float your program until such funding comes back in after you've invoiced for those services. So in Florida, if it's either 45 days to pay or 30, I think it's 45 days that once an invoice comes in, it has to be processed and documented and all of the information has to go through, and it's 45 days at max. Now, granted, we don't try to take 45 days, but it can take that long. And the reason why it may take that long is because you have to document through the process. And if you send an invoice and it's not fully documented, and your outcomes and your deliverables aren't there, and your expenditure doesn't match but was in your approved budget, those kinds of things cause delay. So unfortunately, yes, it takes time for reimbursement.
Okay, we are out of time, but thank you very much, Lavon, Sandi, and Mark, all for being here and sharing your expertise. For attendees, we'll share and follow-up email with links and other things that you heard about during this webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.